Hello, everyone. So with such a small group, I'm going to allow camera for everybody. If you want to come on camera, please feel free to do so. If you would prefer not to, that's absolutely fine as well. Fantastic. So I'll just give people a minute to arrive. Hi. Hi, Andy. How are you? Good. Fantastic. Okay, so we're a minute in. I'm sure more people will join once we kick off, but it starts with me to say good afternoon, everybody. It's just 1 minute into the afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this webinar today. My name is Ruth Tank. I'm a director at Epion Consulting, and by definition, if you are leading a complex program, you're probably quite busy. So I'll kick off now and say once again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So in terms of what you'll get from this session, it is a small group as expected. Many of you are extremely experienced program leaders. I know I've spoken to some of you already ahead of this session. So what I've done is I've created about 30 minutes of content, might be a little bit more, a little bit less, but I've deliberately left some time at the end. It'd be wonderful if I could hear your insights. Yes, of course, happy to answer any questions, but I'd also like to hear from you guys. You know, you've got this incredible wealth of experience, so any insights, any comments that you can provide will be absolutely fantastic, both for us and for others on the call or listening back. I'm also going to assume a sort of baseline level of knowledge in terms of change management, you know, frameworks, methodologies, that kind of thing. So I'm going to assume you know about things like ADKAR and what's in it for me and change impact assessments and the like. And the intention is for me to try and go beyond the obvious or beyond the basic. And hopefully that will mean that you'll take away something that you didn't already know or hadn't already considered. I'm also going to try to bring things to life with stories. So from my own experience, from projects that I've worked on, to try and bring those insights to life. So again, it's not just looking at a bunch of slides, which is never that much fun. All right, so who are we? Why should you give a monkeys about what we have to say, what I have to say? So we're a small SME business change consultancy. We're a specialist in business change, so that's all we do. We were founded by Nick Smith, who is on the call today. If you can give everybody a wave. Nick. So Nick founded the company in 2020 during COVID, or just as COVID was kicking off. So I know that was an awful lot of fun for Nick starting a business at that time. But we have been, you know, reasonably successful since then over the last 4 years. We don't generally do business strategy per se. So we specialize in strategy execution. So what that means is you will have an idea of where you want to get to. You'll have an idea of the to be state, the future state. And what we do, so looking at the top left of this slide, when we talk about change strategy, what that means is you know the what of what you want to do, and we help you with the how. So how are you going to get from A to B? How are you going to execute that change? And we do this through a combination of change management support, communications and engagement, learning, upskilling, that might be training support, that kind of thing. We also will bring in project management support where that's required, or creative to elevate some of our content and make it that little bit more engaging. And we don't have a kind of set methodology. So in contrast to a lot of consultancies out there that have this kind of this set methodology that they sort of plonk on every single project that they do, that's sort of that cookie cutter approach, we prefer the analogy of a kitchen. So we bring principles, we bring tools, we bring our own experience, and we blend that together to meet the specific needs of the client and the specific needs of the program. And part of what I'm going to be discussing today is why that matters. So why that tailored approach matters, and why, you know, those cookie cutter one size fits all approaches aren't as successful. In terms of the industries that we've worked with, we've done a lot of work with national infrastructure, especially sort of rail engineering type companies, but we've also worked with pharmaceutical companies. We've done large transformations in FTSE 100s, for example, also smaller organisations, smaller private sector organisations, as well as public sector, so local government, central government, that kind of thing. In terms of the types of change that we've worked with, that could be, you know, straightforward technology rollouts, so a software deployment, that kind of thing, ERP solutions, CRM solutions, you know, Microsoft 365, or it could be those wider digital transformations or op model changes, restructures, M&A, that kind of thing. And finally, on this slide, I have called out innovation and culture change specifically because while a lot of the approaches and the tools that we might use would be similar, both innovation capability, so building innovation capability and implementing or executing culture change are incredibly complicated. They're incredibly complex and often underestimated in terms of the level of support that's required, but they are something where we bring some expertise as well. So here are some of my credentials, so publications, that kind of thing, and along the bottom, some of our affiliations and badges and stuff like that. Right, so the challenge, as many of you will be familiar with the stat that 70% of change initiatives still fail. You will have heard of that, I'm sure. And I recently did some digging into this to try to get a sense of whether this was just one of these stats that kind of keeps on with no basis to it, but this does actually have a lot of basis, in fact, to this day. So the evidence still suggests that 70%, the vast majority of change initiatives, still fail to achieve their objectives. Why is this? Well, whilst lots of program leaders, whilst lots of senior leaders are continuing to invest in tools, in processes, in technology, it's that human element, it's that people element that continually seems to be deprioritized, underinvested, and underconsidered its importance. Why does this matter? Because you will, I'm sure, have heard of words like polycrisis and VUCA. So that means volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So that is the world that we're living in, this VUCA world, this polycrisis situation. We have disruptive technologies, which are upending whole industries. We have AI, we have climate change. So we are operating in this extremely difficult market conditions. And what that means is the impact of this is that the average lifespan of companies is dropping significantly. So 67 was the average lifespan of a company about 80 years ago, and that has dropped to just 15 years, and that was 2023, so that's recent data from EY. So this inability to execute change and react quickly to the VUCA environment, this incredibly volatile environment, is increasingly, it's an existential threat for organizations. Companies that can't do this well are increasingly at risk of failing, of not being around in, you know, a decade from now. And why should you care specifically as a program leader or a change leader? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly sensing that it's a difficult market out there. Market conditions are difficult, budgets are getting squeezed, competition for jobs is getting tougher. And the ability to be able to demonstrate that you are able to lead successful change, bucking that trend and being one of the few projects that does deliver the intended benefits, the intended outcomes, well, that's got to be good for you, right? That's got to be good for your career. So why do traditional approaches fail? So typically, when we think about the definition of success from a program management or a project management perspective, it's around this idea of delivering on time, delivering on budget, and delivering within scope. So those are the kind of standard metrics. Now, I'm going to argue that those aren't necessarily the only things that you should be measuring in terms of success, and they might not even be the most important. But even if we're just looking at project success through that lens, performance is still pretty poor, and good engagement can help. So you can see the stats on the screen. This is reasonably recent data from McKinsey. 80% of public sector IT projects overran and half of private sector projects overran. So of course that's going to have an impact on cost, it's going to have an impact on timescales, and it's going to make those projects much less likely to succeed. But good engagement can help. And if I can give an example from my own experience, I was working with a well-known high street supermarket. You will have heard of them. I won't mention them by name, but I can guarantee you will have heard of them. And we were doing an exercise and we were engaging with people, and we had a couple of interviews, and suddenly somebody piped up and said, well, what about the Southeast Asia office? And we said, what about them? And they said, well, there are 5,000 people out there. And sure enough, we went and we spoke to them, and they had unique business needs, they had unique business processes, and we were able to bring them into the project. Now, had we not gone out and done that engagement exercise, either we would have ended up designing a product, designing a software that wasn't fit for purpose, so it wasn't going to meet their needs, or we would have had to pause the project, and with the result in obviously project delays and potentially all those overruns that we've seen. So good engagement can really help mitigate those risks. And this webinar is specifically around complex programs. And the more complex the program is, the more you need those eyes and ears on the ground. So to give another example, an organisation I was working with, a life sciences company, they're global. They were rolling out their operating model, a new operating model, to their international affiliates, and it was around improving pharmacovigilance. Now, I'm not an expert in pharmacovigilance, and I'm not an expert in the operating conditions of South Africa or Argentina. And each of those geographies had nuances in terms of regulation, in terms of ways of working, business process, that kind of thing. And through building out that broad scale engagement, I had allies out there, I had people with their eyes and ears on the ground who could feed that information back to me before any of those errors took place, before there was that situation of missing something important, which is more important the more complex the change. So far, so good. Let's say that you've delivered everything on time, on budget, and within scope. Tick, tick, tick. I'm going to argue now that even if you deliver that, even if you run a perfect project from the perspective of those KPIs, it's still going to be a failure. It's still going to fail to deliver benefits if you don't deliver genuine outcomes, genuine benefits for the organization. And that might sound really obvious, but most business cases, in my experience, assume 100% adoption. So we've all had the situation where a software vendor will come and they will pitch to the team, they'll pitch to the IT director or the board, or whoever that might be, and they paint this wonderful picture of all of these benefits that the organization is going to reap in terms of, productivity, streamlining business processes, increasing efficiency, all of that kind of thing. But the assumption is that everybody uses it, and the assumption that is everybody uses it in the way that the software vendor wants them to use it, in that standardized way of working. And as we know, that certainly is not guaranteed. So one super simple question that you can ask yourself when defining how to measure these business outcomes is, what does the organization need to be good at? So if it's a private sector organisation, a company, it's going to be, does it help me sell more stuff? Does it help me lower costs? Does it help me improve my customer retention? You know, all of those are the things that that an organisation, that a company will need to be good at. If it's public sector, it's going to be about delivering better services, delivering services to citizens or to other key stakeholders. So that sounds simple, but often what I see is that these programs measure success in, does it help me move more paper around? Does it help me, you know, add more bureaucracy? And those are not the things that are going to deliver those genuine organisational outcomes. So as a program leader, the extent to which you can map your KPIs onto those outcomes, onto those adoption metrics, is going to be much more likely to deliver success than, you know, whether you could tick the boxes of deploying a solution, because unless that solution is going to deliver business outcomes, it's not going to be a success. So those are the sorts of things that you can be talking to your senior leaders about. You can be talking to this steering co about, you know, all of these fantastic business outcomes, organizational outcomes that you're going to deliver. Fantastic. However, please, please, please remember, nobody else cares. So nobody else across the business is going to give a monkeys whether or not the CEO makes his or her bonus at the end of the year. And again, I see this a lot. You know, people are talking about productivity savings. They're sending out communications about, you know, streamlining business processes and efficiency savings and all of this kind of wonderful stuff. And if I'm, you know, Jenny from accounts, why do I care if the organization is more productive? That just means I'm working harder for the same amount of pay. So that's not what those throughout the business are necessarily going to care about. So this links with this idea of what's in it for me. This will be an obvious a concept that I'm sure you've heard of. So the what's in it for me, of course, for senior leadership is around those organisational outcomes. But I think going beyond the obvious, yes, I'm sure you'll be aware that you need to identify those benefits for other stakeholders outside the leadership team. Fine. But many change practitioners still assume that they know what the benefits are for those broader groups of stakeholders, for those impacted by the change. They assume that they're going to be the same between one organisation and another. They assume they're going to be the same between, you know, any finance department. And they assume that they're going to be the same at that individual level as well. So each of the individuals within the organisation. And that simply isn't true. And I can give a number of examples to prove this point. So there's a piece of HR software we're rolling out, and it had the ability to track diversity data. So you know, gender, sexuality, that kind of thing. And this was fantastic for the London office, because they had a big EDI initiative, and it enabled them to gather data for the first time on diversity across the organisation. Voluntary, of course, but still, you know, it gave them a valuable data set. However, they also have an office in Dubai, and in Dubai it is illegal to be gay. And so just simply having that box was putting staff at significant risk. Now, through doing engagement, we discovered this. We were able to you know, remove that box in Dubai. But that's a really good example where even within the same organisation, the benefits are very, very different. And in some cases, what's a benefit in one area is a significant disbenefit somewhere else. So understanding that is really, really critical. It's important to take into account the culture, of course, the culture of the organisation as a whole. So we do a lot of work in safety critical organisations. So the railways, for example, is an environment in which people sadly still lose their lives on the railways. And so clearly safety is a huge driver in that type of organisation. And what that means from a change context is that often there is that, alongside that risk aversion, which you definitely want to keep, right? You don't want people in a safety critical environment taking risks around safety. but there's often a link between that and risk aversion and change aversion. So those ideas are often linked. So by understanding that culture of the organization, you can adapt your approach accordingly. And the way that you're going to roll out change in a safety critical organization is going to be different from a tech startup, for example, or a tech organization where you may have heard this term, move fast and break things. So, using that same approach across those two types of organizations just is not going to be as effective. You also need to consider the context of the change. So what else is going on? And I'm guessing that most of you don't have the luxury of having just one change in the pipeline. I think gone are the days where organizations would just do one IT project or one change project, get that done, and then move on to the next. We're in this incredibly complex situation now where change is constant. And people are dealing with complex portfolios. You might have 10, you might have 100. I mean, I worked in one organization during a merger where they had over 100 individual IT projects on the go, including a massive custom ERP system implementation, which you can imagine was certainly complex. And these priorities are going to overlap. These priorities are going to compete, and all of that is going to then have an impact on all of the people who are impacted by each of those individual changes and the sum of that complexity. So by way of example, one client we're actually currently working with has been through a large modernization program recently, and we're in there doing a subsequent program, and it's a custom build piece of software. And we really have to be aware that this is a group of people who they've been through a lot. They've had a lot of change on their plate. And what that means is, for us, we have to take them on that journey a bit more gently. We have to account for the fact that they have a limited capacity for that change. So again, we build that in terms of tailoring our approach. And finally, I spoke about the individual context, and this, I think, is one that is often surprising. And it's the one where I still, when I'm doing discovery work, I will still occasionally get surprises, because I'm, like anyone, I make assumptions that are often challenged. And this is an example of a piece of call center software that we were rolling out, and this was pre-COVID. So this was before working from home was ubiquitous. It was before really many people worked from home. And of course, you can imagine in a call center, the idea was, well, people were coming to a central location and making calls from that central location. And this call center software was going to enable people to work from home, to be able to take calls from home. And we thought, fantastic, this is going to be a great benefit for people. They're not going to have to commute. They're going to save all that time. It's going to be wonderful. And then we went out and spoke to people, and we realized that a lot of the people were early careers. So they were in their early 20s. And they were living in shared houses, for example. They were living with their parents, and they were working from the kitchen table. They were working on beds sometimes. And what we'd thought of as a huge benefit, they were saying, no, I have physical issues because I don't have an ergonomic setup. I'm getting back pain. And so from a physical health point of view, it wasn't great. From a mental health point of view, it wasn't great. These were people who hadn't built the networks that those of us on the call probably take for granted. They hadn't got those working relationships developed that they could fall back on. So that was a situation where we made an assumption, and that assumption turned out to be wrong, and we had to adapt our approach accordingly. So what's the answer? So I've given you a lot of problems. What's the answer? The answer is empathy, right? And I'm afraid there are no shortcuts here. You have to ask people what they actually care about. And only once you have the answer to that question can you do the second stage, which is tailoring your communications, tailoring your engagement, and tailoring your training content to what people actually care about, rather than what you assume that people care about. And this brings me to my third point, which is, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear, my last point, which is that engagement is often, so this is, again, when these kind of received wisdoms, you'll say to me, of course, of course we know the importance of engagement, but often engagement is seen as a transactional activity within a program context. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's seen as things like requirements gathering. It's seen as things like transferring information to people, so telling people what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, what they need to do differently. So that's sort of very tell method of communication. And so often what happens is I'll go into a program and people will say to me, don't worry, Ruth, you don't need to go out and talk to people. We've already sent out a survey. We've already sent out a BA. We've got our requirements gathered. We know what the system needs to do, for example. And this is where I would challenge and say there is a subtle nuance to actually going out and speaking to people, because what you're doing there is you're building trust and you're building trusted relationships. So it's not just about what you get in terms of information, it's about what you give in terms of your time, in terms of your attention. And I think this is where a lot of people sort of misunderstand this term resistance, because fundamentally resistance usually stems from a lack of trust. So we've heard about all these, these 70% of change projects are failing. Well, what that means is most people they're bruised, they're cynical, they have all these experiences of changes that haven't gone well. And they just don't trust you, frankly. They don't trust that this isn't going to be just another disaster, just another initiative that withers on the vine. And the issue with the word resistance is that it suggests that the problem is with the other person. So we talk about, user resistance, stakeholder resistance, and actually often it's not a problem with them. It's a problem with the environment and the lack of trust within that environment. So the first step really is about building that trust. And you can only really do that through this active listening exercise. And once you've done your active listening exercise, this communication, but communicating as openly and as honestly as possible. And you might say to me, look, if we say stuff, then if we say too much, then people will hold us to it, or we'll get this backlash. But I would challenge that, and by way of example, to prove the point, I was working on a project. It was about 10 years ago now, so all in the public domain. British Airways going through a widely publicised redundancy situation. They were, it was a consultation process, and I was working within that environment, working closely with legal, working closely with HR. And of course, their perspective was, let's lock everything down. Let's not say anything, because this is such a high risk situation that if we say the wrong thing, the risks are huge, the consequences are huge. And of course, that is true. And of course, there are situations where you can't communicate as honestly or as openly as you would like. But my position was, let's tell people why we can't say certain things. So let's, instead of just not saying anything, what we need to be doing is saying, look, this is the process, this is how it works, this is what we can tell you, this is what we can't tell you, this is when you will find out more information, even if I can't tell you now. And the result of that was that actually, instead of that lack of trust and that fractious situation, okay, the situation wasn't easy. The project was still really, really difficult, but it was a lot easier than it would have been without that open and honest communication. So you're probably sitting there, you're thinking, oh, this stuff sounds really hard. That empathetic listening sounds really hard. It's time consuming, it's difficult. And you're right, it is. That this active listening stuff is a specialist skill set. And even I, having done this for, more years than I care to mention, whenever I do these exercises with clients, I'm by the end of the day, I'm absolutely exhausted, because it's really hard to do well. It's really hard to give that time and attention, and really empathetically listen to what people have to say. So now that's about half an hour of content, which I'm fantastically proud that I'm only 13 seconds over. So now it's really over to you. We've got 15 minutes and I've got some questions here for you to think about, but I'm going to hand over to Nick in a minute to go through any questions that you might have or your insights. As I said, I'd be really interested to hear your insights as well. But just by way of summary, these are some things to be taking away with you. Have you done that exercise around outcomes, organizational outcomes? Do you really understand what the business needs to be good at? Do you understand what people really care about? And have you listened? Have you generated that bank of goodwill so that people will help you with the project? Have you tailored your approach? Have you considered the culture, the change context, the specific needs of each of the individuals within it? And have you reflected that in your materials that you've created? And then finally, have you understood the commercial impact of that, of not getting this right? So on the right, you can see some stats of what the return on investment actually is, and it's pretty compelling. And although it is difficult to do this direct mapping of cause and effect onto a lot of these benefits, I think with a bit of creativity, it is certainly possible. So those are my questions for you to consider. Nick, do we have anything in the chat, or do we have any questions from anybody? I'm just going to unmute everybody.
We don't as yet. There's both the chat and there is a Q&A button there. So please, if you would feel more comfortable putting a question into the Q&A or into the chat rather than speaking out loud, please do that. Put your hand up or whatever would be fine. Ruth, I'd want to start with you used the phrase capacity for change at one point. Could you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, so without going too much into the sort of the neuroscience behind this, that they have done studies, and I can provide references for anyone who's interested, that show that when people are in a high stress situation, they release a lot of cortisol. You may have heard of that. That's the stress hormone. And they've shown that there's a direct link between the amount of cortisol in the system and the ability for you to absorb and remember information. They did some studies with children on this. So it really is a physical condition that when people are in a stressed situation, they find it harder to learn. So if you're trying to train somebody on a new system or a new business process, that is going to be less effective if people are in a stress state. So what you need to do is, first of all, reduce that stress, give people that certainty, create that safe space, create psychological safety for people, and then they will have that capacity to absorb new information. I mean, that's one perspective. Nick, was there anything else that you wanted to add on that?
No, other than building on that, the idea that research suggests that the single biggest factor in determining psychological safety, which, as you say, feeds into that capacity for change, the single biggest factor is line manager behavior. And therefore, certainly something we do is to look at how we would, rather than blame people for resisting change, to try and get under the surface and understand why we're seeing those behaviors, and then work with line managers to coach them to find ways to increase the psychological safety levels among those who are working with them. It's kind of trying to get to root causes rather than merely looking at symptoms. And really good engagement sometimes feels a bit like shouting, or really creative communication and creative engagement tools sometimes feel a bit like shouting louder at people who are not in a position to listen.
Yeah, 100%. So I've just seen, Andy, you've got a question there. Do you want to come off mute and ask it, or would you like me to just read it from the Q&A section?
Go for it from the Q&A. I can't remember what I said now. It was really around, well, I guess it was around strategies for, your advice around, tailoring change management strategies.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. So you said tailoring change management strategies for deploying a new way of working for optimizing a business process change, for example. So in terms of tailoring, yes, the first thing is to understand, doing something like a business process map or something, so that you can understand the delta, if that's not too technical, between the as is and the to be. So what's the difference between those? And that's going to vary significantly, particularly with a business process change. That's going to vary significantly depending on the roles impacted. So you're going to end up with people who have a massive change, and some people who have a smaller change. The types of change across the role can be different as well. So business process change might also require a behavior change, an op model change, so those are ways in which a change impact can be bigger or smaller. So that's the kind of obvious best practice type answer. I think that speaking to, I guess, the thread throughout this this talk of going beyond the kind of standard methodologies that you would deploy, in terms of how listening can impact that, you would be looking out for and co-creating that to be state, or the as much as possible understanding the perspective of the people that who are going to be impacted. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. So for example, what I often find when I'm doing discovery workshops, for example, is I go in with a really, really open question, which is, what's stopping you getting your work done right now? And often I'll get a challenge that says, well, we're only rolling out a new piece of software, for example, that has nothing to do with anything else. Or people will say, well, don't ask people about everything, because then you'll get stuff that isn't relevant. So you'll get them whinging about their line manager, or you'll get them whinging about the fact that they don't have a particular piece of equipment. And that's how it's described to us. And what I find is, point number one, when you ask that big question, you get everybody to effectively offload everything, right? And once they've offloaded, they're in a much more receptive, productive and creative state of mind. So they've gone from problems into solutions, right? Once they've got all of the problems off their chest. Point number two is, sometimes there's something that you think might be irrelevant to a piece of software that actually becomes incredibly relevant, or a business, any type of change. So for example, somebody might have an issue with their performance management system, or their performance management methodology, the way that their performance is managed by their line manager. Now, that could be something that you can bring into scope, either through a technology or a process change, for example, by just building in something, a slight tweak, or something that's slightly different. You can often hand those problems on to somebody else who might be more willing to take those on. So you find opportunities that otherwise wouldn't have come to light. And thirdly, as I said, once you've got people in that creative state of mind, they will then usually start making suggestions. So they'll be saying, oh, well, I suppose we could do that, or oh, I wonder if we could do that. And once people are co-creating the solutions, they're owning them. And once they own them, they're much more likely to do the thing that you're asking them to do. And so finally, the last question I usually ask is, if I had a magic wand, what would you change about your working environment right now? And what that will help to do is go from this massive brain dump of everything that's wrong to the things that actually matter. So the things, the 2 or 3 things that are the real gotchas, the real important issues. So sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded approach. Was that helpful, Andy?
Yeah, no, it was. I
Very
was just,
interesting.
sorry, I don't need to hijack the meeting. I will say one other thing. So I think what you said is, would you advocate for, change agents then? So when you're talking about, asking people that download, you're building that advocacy, so you're getting people
Yeah.
to act as sort of change agents.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
So yes, but we would differentiate between 3 different roles of a change agent. So often people lump talk about change champions or change agents, and actually they tend to be doing 3 different things, and often those things are slightly mutually exclusive. So sometimes you want a super user. So a super user is a real subject matter expert, and they might be somebody who has deep technical knowledge of a system or, a particular, engineering process or something like that. And those are the people that you want to be a point of contact for users to ask questions. How does this system work? What do I do in this sort of situation? They are not the same people as those that you might call advocates. So the advocates are the people who you're going to who are going to be banging the drum and talking about why something's such a great thing. Now, the technical experts might not have that skill set. They might not have the skill set to be the person who stands up in a meeting and talks about something. Perhaps they're really shy. They're really clever, but they're really shy. So then you have your advocates, and then you have your networkers, I would say. So those are the people who are not necessarily saying something's great, but they're the people who have these really strong networks throughout the organization. So they can tell you, oh, well, okay, such and such a person, you need to talk to them, or such and such a person, you need to talk to them. And they're the people who will keep you connected, and often identify those pockets of quotes resistance or people who are going to need a bit more support.
Thanks, Ruth.
Got a comment from Pierre-Yves around the what you need if you're going to be able to not just listen to people, but give them a sense that being listened to is worth it. And I think good points there, Pierre-Yves, about the engagement being genuine across the business, but that back end of a process and organization to actually manage and respond to it. So thank you for that. Joanna, you raised the question about how you approach managing competing priorities. Do you want me to come back on that one, Ruth?
Yeah, sure.
Give your voice a break. Joanna, I think we found that it's really important to be clear whether it's competing and conflicting in the sense of mutually incompatible priorities or ones that are competing because they're competing for time. Where it's that they're competing for time or attention and are conflicting in that sense, we try and work on encouraging, facilitating, building a portfolio approach. And in particular, something we're doing with a set of programs at the moment with one client, actually trying to find a way to integrate at the point of impact. So so one might say that instead of merely sequencing or establishing a cadence, we're trying to find a way of talking about to think first and foremost about the audience, the same community who are impacted by all of them, and then trying to communicate in an integrated, coherent manner about all the priorities and initiatives, and almost build release packages of change. So that instead of there being, here's a bundle of change from this program or a bundle of change from this program, rather, here's this quarter's bundle of change, drawing on multiple ones. That's hard work. It's not very common, but it's what we're trying to do there. I think where the priorities are conflicting in the sense of being mutually incompatible, that's far harder, and that often, self-evidently, I guess, requires going up the leadership chain to get some resolution and prioritization by them. I think what we found there is that it's not uncommon for leaders, surprisingly, not to be aware that they're asking for multiple things that are incompatible. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, yeah, thanks. It's just I was interested in anybody's perspective on how they might have managed it in an environment where, you know, we're being asked to do something. So I work in local government. We have relationships with a lot of strategic partners across health, other blue light organisations, third sector. You know, we're all kind of codependent in delivering change and improvement, but offer, you know, our priorities are determined by external factors that don't always work together. So I was really interested in kind of, you know, obviously we know as change practitioners that it requires an investment of time, and we don't always have the luxury of time. So what are the most impactful activities that we can do relatively quickly, or where do we need to invest that time up front to maybe unlock some of the challenges that we come across later on?
So I think last point from me, I'm just aware that we're at time here, but I think it does come back to that that outcomes piece. What's going to deliver the biggest and the best impact? And I do see a lot of change programs that get stuck in that delivering a thing, deploying a thing, rather than delivering an outcome. And people, you know, pet projects and, you know, projects that a particular leader is sponsoring become, you know, get prioritized when perhaps they're not delivering quite the same outcomes as something, you know, perhaps less popular. But I'm just conscious we're a minute over now. So fantastic discussion. I'm sorry we weren't. Gloria, I saw that you had a question that we couldn't get to. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions and comments. Please do feel free to reach out directly if you want to explore any of these issues further. If you feel that your program could benefit for some specialist business change support, I'm going to share this deck. You can see there's some contact details on there at the bottom. And yes, it just remains for me to say thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a wonderful weekend when it comes, and have a wonderful holiday in a couple of weeks, which I'm sure is on everybody's mind as well. So fantastic. Thanks very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.